Okay, so in this next lecture, we're going to be looking at Descartes, someone you've probably heard of, but maybe haven't read before. We're going to be reading his text, Meditations on First Philosophy. Hopefully you ordered the copy of the book that I had listed on the syllabus and that the bookstore stocked. If not, you can find other versions of this text online. It's a bit of a problem translation-wise. You'll probably see some words that have been translated differently if you use an online text, but it's not a huge problem. I do recommend, if you're going to use something that you find online, that you run it past me in advance. I also would try to use something by Cress if you can find it online. You'll see there on the slide it says translated from Latin by Cress, and this is pretty much the authoritative translation. It's the translation that's considered to be the best. You'll see a lot of translations from French, but Descartes actually wrote the text in Latin, so this translation is just a bit superior. All page references that you'll see in the lecture notes and the slides will correspond to the text on the right. In previous semesters, I've used the text on the left, which is combined with the discourse on method. That's the only reason I'm pointing that out to you. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is I'm going to first talk about Descartes from a biographical standpoint. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context, historically speaking, within which he wrote his philosophy, and I'll make a few other introductory comments, and then I'll go ahead and start with the first meditation. In each lecture subsequent to this one, I'll cover only one chapter or meditation of the text, so there will be in total 6 YouTube lectures for you to watch. So Descartes was born in 1596. He died in 1650. He's often called the father of modern philosophy, and I should explain what that means. He's considered to be someone who instituted or founded, or the so-called father, to use this patriarchal language, modern philosophy, to the extent that he broke with the tradition that was dominant before his time. And that tradition was the tradition of scholastic philosophy. If you've heard of St. Thomas Aquinas, he's a scholastic philosopher. If you've heard of even people like Aristotle, Aristotle's the person who kind of really, in ancient Greece, gets scholastic ways of thinking set into motion. And really, scholastic philosophy is defined by a very Aristotelian approach to reality, to science, and to answering difficult questions. And it's completely opposite from Plato. I'll explain a little bit about that as we move on here. What's so different about Descartes' philosophy from this old system of scholastic, post-Aristotelian or neo-Aristotelian philosophy is that Descartes was the founder of a new scientific, physical, mechanistic way of approaching philosophy. He's someone who had much better mathematics, had much better science at his disposal than people like Aquinas, or even people like Plato, or Aristotle, or Anselm, or what have you. So, and I'll be talking about this a bit today, but really what's noteworthy about him and the extent to which we call him the father of modern philosophy is that he kind of scientifically revolutionizes the way that philosophy was practiced a few hundred years ago. A little bit of biographical details about him. He was a Roman Catholic. He attended Jesuit schools. Jesuit priests are an order of Catholic priests, just like the Puritan. The majority of the Catholic universities in the United States are actually Jesuit schools. If you've heard of places like Fordham or Boston College or Villanova, these are all Jesuit schools. The Jesuits are known for being academics and scholars and educators. As I said, Descartes got started around the time that Aristotelian was still kind of a dominant philosophical worldview, specifically in the guise or in the variation of scholastic philosophy, as it's called. So when Descartes went through school, he got a lot of Aristotle. That said, we know for a fact that Descartes had also read plenty of Plato. He was aware of other ancient Greek philosophers. He wasn't someone who had only read Aristotle and was ignorant of everything else. He was pretty well read across the ancient Greek tradition. Descartes' father wanted him to become a lawyer, so he actually went and got that degree. But after getting that degree at Poitiers, he became a military officer in the Dutch military. And this all happens before Descartes' intellectual, scholastic career really took off. Before he came up, for example, with his famous mathematical innovations, before he came up with his revolutionary philosophical works. Descartes moved from Paris to Amsterdam and then back to Paris late in his life. You can, if you visit Amsterdam, view the apartment within which he lived. It's still there. So it's a pretty cool thing to check out if you're ever in that part of Europe. A brief sort of footnote here is Descartes noteworthy for corresponding with Christina. She was the Queen of Sweden. She is someone who really helped Descartes refine and improve his philosophical views. And the reason why I mention this is that conventional tellings of history will kind of downplay, kind of undermine the extent to which women have had an impact in philosophy. And it's a problem, right? We're always trying to get more women to study philosophy, to major in philosophy, to become philosophy professors, to become philosophers. But throughout history, there's actually many women who have been involved with philosophy, many women who have impacted philosophy, who have had a big impact on it. And Christina is certainly someone who had a big impact on Descartes. I believe that in the version of the text which I had the bookstore procure, you will find the letters that Descartes and Christina exchanged, where she asked some really good, really difficult, important questions about Descartes' thought. And he was really, as I said, able to improve his ideas based on these criticisms and these questions that she asked him. As for Descartes' mathematical inventions, he's pretty much the pioneer, the inventor of what's called analytic geometry. He came up with the Cartesian coordinate system, if you've ever taken a geometry class and worked with basic graphs, right? That's a Descartes invention, actually. And he also formulated the sine law of refraction. Descartes' academic and intellectual career kind of went through a few different phases. He went from mathematics to so-called natural philosophy and finally ended up in metaphysics. And the text meditation that we're going to be reading and I'm going to be lecturing upon is a text that is situated in this last phase of his work. It's definitely a text that's concerned with metaphysical questions. One last note that I'd like to add about Descartes is that he had to keep back some of his work to avoid controversy, to avoid condemnation, to avoid punishment. He lived kind of around the same approximate time that Galileo lived, and you're probably someone who's heard the stories of how Galileo's theories drew a lot of criticism, how he was considered someone who, with his science, was kind of pushing against religion, pushing against scriptural sorts of truths. And in the 1600s, don't forget either that people were still being burned at the stake for saying the wrong thing. People were still being killed for professing so-called heretical, anti-religious, anti-Catholic, anti-Christian doctrines. So this is kind of part of the reason why Descartes had to hold back and repress some of his own work. So as for the context of Descartes' writing, the main thing to focus on is that during this point in history, there were a lot of shifts that were occurring. And this is the early modern period. And these shifts that are occurring really result from a lot of really rapid scientific advancement. We have a lot of old ways of looking at the world that maybe are mythological or religious that are being basically overturned. If you've read this really famous book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he talks in this book about paradigm shifts that have occurred throughout human history and have really radically reoriented the way that we conceive of knowledge and we conceive of reality itself and how we're able to accurately describe reality and so on. This is very much what we're talking about when it comes to Descartes. There were a lot of paradigm shifts that had recently occurred. So I give you a list here of really important scientific advancements that were contemporaneous with Descartes' own writing, roughly contemporaneous, meaning at the same approximate time. You have Copernicus, you have Kepler, you have Galileo, you have Hooke, you have his student Boyle, and you have also a lot of advancements. I mean, Hooke, for example, is someone who falls into this category. A lot of advancements in scientific instrumentation, things like the magnifying glass, things like the telescope. A little bit earlier in 1440 at Gutenberg, you had the printing press, right, which completely sort of changed the game. No longer were monks copying by hand texts, but it was possible to, on a larger scale, create books. And of course, on a larger scale, these texts were able to reach more people. Lastly, you also had a lot of cartographical advancements. Cartography is just the practice of creating maps, drawing maps that reflect geography, that reflect the layout of the planet, the seas, the land masses, and so on. So what's the point here? Why did I tell you all these things about the context of Descartes' writing? Well, the point is that there were a lot of new questions that were coming up that were based on a scientific way of looking at the world. Again, you had a lot of scientific advancement that was happening really rapidly. A lot of paradigm shifts were occurring. And people were starting to realize, and when I say people, I mean scientists, but more specifically here, philosophers. What is the world really like, right? There's so many things that we used to think about the world that we're now finding out just aren't true or just are inadequate, right? Think of the first time someone, for example, postulated the idea of a cell, or postulated the idea of an atom, right? The world was getting larger, so to speak. We were becoming aware of so much more in such a brief period of time. And the question here wasn't just what is the world really like, but also the question, what is it that we're still wrong about, right? We're realizing that a lot of our previous ways of answering questions about reality were inadequate or were misguided. Surely now today there's things that we're still misguided about and we don't know. So this is very much what's going to motivate Descartes' project. And the problem really isn't just as simple as not knowing what the world is like, right? The problem kind of has to do with the very nature of scientific methodology in the West. If our knowledge is constantly changing, right? If we're constantly revising our beliefs, if we're constantly revising and improving our theories, which is part of the scientific method, according to Francis Bacon and other important philosophers and scientists from the history of science, well then how can we be sure of anything at any one point in time that we think we know? Isn't it always possible that we're completely in the dark, that we're maybe getting closer to the truth, but we're still extremely far away from adequate, correct understanding of something? And the fear, of course, is maybe we could be so wrong about what we think we know that not even science itself could be trustworthy, right? Maybe science itself could be a misguided method. Maybe science itself could be something that could only sometimes produce satisfactory results, that could only sometimes give us accurate, useful knowledge that really mapped onto the way the world really was. Lastly, just one bit of context and biography about Descartes before I move to this first meditation. I want to explain a little bit the specific theoretical perspective that Descartes had. I think I've already told you that Descartes, earlier in one of my lectures, is like Leibniz, someone who is considered a rationalist. And he's also someone who's joined in this approximate school of philosophy by Spinoza. The rationalists were people who thought that reason, or rationality, or intellect was an ultimate epistemological source. Now remember, epistemology is this word that just means science of knowledge. So when I say that reason or rationality or intellect is an ultimate epistemological source, what I mean is that these things, these faculties are basically like a foundation for knowledge, a foundation for knowing something. And what's important here is that we focus on what's excluded, right? I said reason, rationality, intellect, your mind, so to speak. What we're excluding here are things like the senses. What we're excluding are things like experience, right? We're saying maybe these things are useful, and you'll see in Descartes he will use sense perception to draw some pretty important conclusions, but we can't just focus on the senses. We can't just focus on experience. We can't really come up with certain knowledge if we rely only on these sources. So the big difference here is between then rationalism and empiricism on the other hand. Empiricism, which says the senses and experience and observation are all you need. Now, I already kind of said this a moment ago, but for the rationalists, the objective or the goal wasn't just knowledge that was probable, wasn't just knowledge that was possible, but was knowledge, rather, that was certain. 100% certain knowledge is what the rationalists were after. And they were particularly interested in knowledge a priori, right? Knowledge prior to experiences. Truths, conclusions that could be arrived at using only pure reason, right? You didn't have to go out in the world and look for confirmation of what your theory was. Your theory was just self-evident, using mental power alone. So Descartes in particular, but really Leibniz and Spinoza as well, have a very sort of mechanical view of nature, a very mechanical view of reality. They kind of viewed nature and the universe as a really complex clock, as something like a machine that was put together in this really ordered way, this way that made a lot of sense, this way where all the parts fit together. And all we had to do was figure out how these connections worked, right? We just had to reason out, using our minds again, how this complex machine must be situated, must be structured. Now, in addition to being opposed to empiricism, where we rely on senses and experience and observation for knowledge, rationalism is also often contrasted with idealism. Idealism is something that is exemplified by Plato, who we read. It's also exemplified by Berkeley, who the University of California campus Berkeley is named after, but he was a Scottish philosopher. His name's Berkeley. A little bit different way that we pronounce that name. And people who are idealists, contra, meaning as opposed to the rationalists, thought that everything really was ultimately just an idea, right? If we perceived something like a chair, then really all that we were perceiving wasn't some real chair extended in reality, something that was really there, but was just an idea, was just something in your mind. So idealists kind of have this theory that all of reality, all of nature, is confined to first-person consciousness, right? It's something that's all in your head, so to speak. And the rationalists don't actually go this far. It might actually seem otherwise. It might seem like that's what they were getting at based on the description I gave you. But the rationalists, as I said, had a very mechanical view of nature and reality. They thought that they could use reason and pure rationality to draw true conclusions about the way external reality was. And the way I said that there is a big hint, right? External reality. They believed in such a thing. Idealists really couldn't, right? If everything was just an idea, whether it's your interaction with your friend or what you see with your eyeballs or your opinions about beauty or justice or something similar, right, then there is no external reality to think of, no external reality to speak of. Now, one final point here is I would be a bad philosophy professor if I didn't point out that there are so many differences between any given rationalist. If we compare Descartes and Leibniz or compare Descartes and Spinoza, they thought so differently about so many things, but we still group them into this approximate school of philosophy, the rationalists, where they do have some in common. And really this is just something to kind of help us make history books a little bit more clear. The same goes for idealists. Different idealists have a lot of individual differences, and really you don't want to interpret too much from this word. You don't want to assume that any two idealist philosophers were really getting at all of the same ideas. So with this, we'll go ahead and start our first meditation, which is the first chapter of the book. It's relatively short. Here Descartes subtitles this chapter, Concerning the Things That Can Be Called into Doubt. And you'll see that doubt and skepticism are one of the main themes of this book. Descartes starts out by saying, he's been wrong about many things. If he reflects back on his life, there are so many things that he used to believe that now he knows he was wrong about. He knows better now. He realizes that he was in error. And not only did Descartes used to be wrong about some things, but he actually built on top of things about which he was wrong, right? Meaning he had bad foundations. Think maybe of an example here where there's a word that you can't pronounce. And not only are you unable to pronounce the word, but you also don't know what it means. You use it incorrectly. This is the sort of thing we're talking about. You can also think of this in a mathematical sense. Imagine that you thought 1 + 1 = 4, and you built all of your current math knowledge on top of that mistaken idea, right? Of course, 1 + 1 does not equal 4, but if you thought that was the case, and you went through 15 years or so of mathematics, you would have some really twisted, really distorted ideas about math. So, again, remember the context here. There were radical scientific advancements. There was a lot of progress going on. And Descartes is starting to realize that the world maybe isn't what he used to think it was. But Descartes has an idea. He says, if I'm ever really going to know anything, it's obvious that I need a firm and lasting foundation. I need something that I can be sure of as my base layer, and on top of this base layer, I can build everything else. He says also that this firm and lasting foundation could support something like rigorous science, meaning science that was really robust, science that was really certifiable, science that was really trustworthy. So we want to note here in this first chapter, Descartes' philosophy, we'll call it Cartesian philosophy or Cartesian thinking. It's very much a foundationalist way of approaching philosophy. It's like building a system or building a machine, and you're going to start at the bottom. You're going to start with the most basic parts and build into something more complex. But you want to make sure that those first few steps are ones that are absolutely correct, right? That are done completely properly, that are totally certifiable. And this is something that you'll see a lot of rationalist philosophers try to do, right? Obsession with having a correct and rigorous foundation for their thought. So Descartes says if he's going to look for this firm and lasting foundation, he actually doesn't need to refute or disprove everything. He just needs to cast things into doubt. So right away, you want to take note there that doubting is not the same thing as refuting. Doubting something is not the same as disproving something, right? There's a difference there. And what is it that Descartes says about what he's going to doubt? He says, I won't believe anything about which I can't totally be certain, right? So something that he doubts, and doubts in such a way that it is drawn into enough of a question that he can't be sure about it, right? He's not going to believe in that thing. He also notes, though, he doesn't need to doubt absolutely everything. He doesn't need to apply this doubt to everything that's out there. And we call this doubt hyperbolic doubt, extreme doubt, radical doubt, or even Cartesian doubt. He doesn't need to apply it everywhere, but instead, most importantly, upon his foundational principles, those things that he previously had built upon as his bottom layer, those things that he had built upon. So what is it that previously he considered to be most true? What is one of the things that he took to be one of his foundational principles? Well, the idea of the senses. He says on 14 or 18, depending on which version you're reading, that previously the senses are what seemed to him to be most true. But he realizes now that senses fooled him in the past plenty of times, right? And he notes examples like when something looks different when it's far away, and you get closer and it appears to be larger, right? The senses aren't trustworthy in these situations. But he notes it's not always the case that the senses are always wrong. They also, in many cases, seem to be right. They seem to be accurate. So we don't want to just dismiss them wholesale. We don't want to dismiss them completely. And Descartes points out something important here. He says, if I were to doubt these correct, accurate things from my senses, this obvious information that my senses give, and I can't doubt enough that leads me to want to refrain from believing in these things, then doesn't that make me something like a madman? Doesn't that make me something like an insane person? Let's say I'm sitting next to a fire, and I doubt that I see this bright, flame next to me. I doubt that my body feels the warmth generated by the flame. If I were to doubt this obvious information that I presume to be correct, wouldn't that make me seem sort of crazy? And Descartes says, I like to think that I'm not crazy. I like to think that I'm not insane. I like to think that I'm not a madman. I like to think that that's a different type of person, that I'm not one of those people. And he realizes there's one situation that he goes back to quite often, perhaps even every night, where he does seem to be like the insane or crazy person. He says, when I'm dreaming, I sometimes feel as if I am insane. I sometimes feel things with my senses that are completely made up, that are completely inaccurate, that just aren't real, that aren't there. And Descartes says, you know what? There's a big issue, isn't there? If I know that sometimes I have these dreams where I feel as if I'm insane and can't trust my senses, I can't actually know 100% for sure that I'm not dreaming right now. So Descartes will say, maybe I should assume that I am dreaming right now. Maybe I should assume that even my body isn't real, that it only appears to be real in this dream. But there's an important counterpoint here. The content of the dream, Descartes says, is something that always bears likeness to true things. So like a painting of a minotaur, right? It's built out of parts that are aspects of other real animals. There's no painting of some sort of fantasy creature that isn't in a way derived from other creatures that actually exist. Descartes says even an abstract painting, imagine something like a Jackson Pollock painting where you just have paint splashed on a canvas, it still uses true colors. And these paintings are apparently things that are fictitious and false, right? These paintings are things that don't really represent anything, that don't have any content that resembles an animal or a character from scripture or a setting or a sunrise or something like this, right? But at the same time, he insists that they still have to make use of true colors. So what we just said here about dreams in this analogy with painting will go for so-called waking life, so-called reality as well, right? We notice this is true first of the idea of corporeal nature, the idea of having a body, the idea of being extended out into space. But it's not just the idea of physicality, the idea of corporeality, where this is true, but in fact, this is true of a lot of the things that we think about. So what's the point? What's he getting at? Well, it's not necessarily that we can be sure that there are real things like heads and torsos and hands and bodies and desks and chairs and classrooms, but rather what he's saying is that there are simpler things, there are things that are more universal, that are the basis of our experience of these embodied things, of these physical things, of these corporeal things like heads and torsos and hands and classrooms and so on. And he gives us a list. He says, corporeality, extension, shape, size, number, place, and duration. All of these things are composites. They're built out of simpler parts. They're combinations of other things. And he says that any discipline that's based on a composite subject is a doubtful discipline. So he says physics, astronomy, and medicine all fall into this category. But there are other academic disciplines, he says, that aren't based on composites. They're based on basic and general things, and they give us certainty or indubitability, which means completely incapable of being doubted, or even apodicticity, this even fancier word. And he gives examples of disciplines like this that deal with these basic and general things. And the list includes arithmetic and geometry and other sorts of mathematics. So these latter sorts of disciplines are disciplines that are indifferent to existence, meaning that they don't even treat the question of whether their subject matter exists, right? So it's kind of similar to the idea that the triangle doesn't exist, kind of similar to the idea that 3 doesn't exist. It's an idea, it's a concept, it's basic, it's general. But what we want to do is take some non-composites, some of these basic and general things, and try to come up with a preliminary dream proof meaning try to come up with some sort of simple test to enable us to tell whether we're dreaming or not. And in this first meditation, the dream proof that he'll give us is consider 2 plus 3 equals 5. It's that way whether I am dreaming or not. Even if I'm dreaming, it will never seem true that 2 plus 3 equals 6. He gives us the second proof. He says, the square will not have more than 4 sides, whether I am dreaming or not. If I'm dreaming, I cannot encounter a square circle. I cannot encounter a triangular circle. These simple things will remain the same, whether I'm dreaming or not. But he realizes he's being a bit too hasty. He realizes his proof or his test is a bit too preliminary, because there's another problem. There's an issue. There's an issue that will affect even these mathematical and geometric proofs that we can try to use to tell if we're dreaming or not. And that problem is God could be a deceiver, right? It doesn't seem likely that we could be wrong about things like math, things about like arithmetic, unless God is a deceiver. And Descartes notes that some philosophers and theologians from history would rather go so far as to say that God is not all-powerful than they would say that God can bend mathematics, right? Again, just giving you this idea similar to what we saw in Plato of math being on this really high level when it comes to certainty. But Descartes says the less powerful we make God, right? The further we take God from being all-powerful, the more likely it is that we are deceived by this God. So for here, at this point in the first meditation, Descartes points out this big problem. It's at least possible that God is a deceiver. We can't be certain that he isn't one, right? And because of this, we're going to have to doubt a lot more things than we originally had planned. Not just our fundamental, foundational principles, but many other things. And here at the end of this first meditation, Descartes will make a few important notes. He says it's not enough to realize these things that I'm finding in these meditations. Here we're only in the first. But I have to actually remain mindful of these things. I have to remember these things. I can't just momentarily grasp them and then move on. But that's really hard to do, isn't it? He says my old opinions and habits return. As soon as I get out of this radically doubting, this hyperbolically doubting mood or mode, I find that my old habits return, my old opinions, all of these erroneous things that I believe but now know I should probably question, right? I'm tempted to just give back into them. But as I leave behind my doubt and I return to the ordinary world, as I drop my focus, I start again to take things at face value. I don't doubt the existence of the external world. I don't doubt the real existence of my body. I don't doubt that I'm awake. I don't assume that I'm dreaming, right? I just take things as they are. What am I going to do to solve this problem? Well, I'm going to try to assume that all external things are illusions that were created not by an all-good God, but instead by an evil genius. Sometimes we call this an evil demon. It's the same idea as the God as deceiver that I talked about on the previous slide. But this is really difficult, right? It's going to be really hard to assume that everything is an illusion created by this evil entity. So what I'm going to have to do is I'll have to willingly choose to continue these radical doubting meditations on the next day, which will be the next chapter, the second meditation, because now I'm returning to my old naive opinions and I grow tired. So I want to compare just really quickly at the end here the methods of Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes. And I know we didn't go over Aristotle in this particular class because it's accelerated and on a shorter schedule. Plato wanted people to reflect rigorously, carefully, seriously on what they believed, try to recall everything that they actually knew, and cast off everything else. We didn't really get into this, but Plato thought that you could not trust your senses at all, that your senses did not give you knowledge, that they gave you only a copy of the true reality. If you've ever heard of Plato's cave allegory, which I know I briefly mentioned in a previous lecture, that's exactly the idea there. It's one of the most famous parts of the Republic. Aristotle, by contrast, thought that we should start with the senses, that we should get information from them and try to explain confusing experiences by explaining what's confusing in terms that we already understand. So Aristotle didn't exclusively rely on the senses. He did try to use rationality and reason and intellect to explain what the senses tell us. But unlike Plato, for Aristotle, the senses are a starting point, not something to be avoided at all costs. Lastly, we have Descartes, who we're currently occupied with. Descartes, as I've told you, wants to break something up into its smallest, indubitable, meaning certain parts, and then build a structure that's certain and sure and apodictic out of these fundamental pieces. And he thought that this was the only way to really come up with science that was completely trustworthy, science that we could really be confident in. So that's it for this lecture, and we'll pick up with meditation 2 in the next part.